class, Richard Nixon is the only president to ever resign. So what can be said about Richard Nixon? He's been a man that's been like the archetypal idea of a bad president because of the way that he left office. Right? But he was a really complex man. Richard Nixon was born January 9th, 1913, and he died April 22nd, 1994, at the age of 81. His home state is California, and by matter of religion, he was a Quaker. So let's try to break through Richard Nixon's life. Okay, so for one, he was in his 20s when Pearl Harbor is attacked and the United States enters the war. Okay, so he is going to be fighting in the Pacific for the U.S. Navy during World War II. Now, when World War II is over, in 1946, he is going to run to be a member of the House from California. Okay, and at this point, he is not very old. I believe he's 33 at this point. And he wins his seat in 1946. Then, in 1950, he wins an election to the Senate from California as well. All right, so 46, he's in politics. At 40, he's already a statewide office. And then in 1952, he is picked as a running mate for Dwight Eisenhower. All right, so Dwight Eisenhower is very new to politics. He's never had elected office before, and he's older. All right, and so Nixon is going to help balance out that ticket. Now, one thing occurs during this time, 1952, and this had to do with a minor scandal in which Nixon had received improper gifts from donors. Right? And he goes on TV. There's an assumption that he might be leaving the ticket. He might be, dropping from it. And he brings up the fact that he was given this dog, a dog called Checkers, and that his daughters love him and he's going to keep Checkers. And that's going to make the public be much more of a fan of him. So in 52, him and Dwight Eisenhower are going to, as a ticket, win. Right, so Richard Nixon, he is a Republican. His wife is Pat Nixon, who will later be First Lady, and his daughter is Julie. Now, his daughter, Julie Nixon, is going to marry the grandson of his president, Dwight Eisenhower. So David Eisenhower and Julie Nixon are going to get married, and so the Nixon-Eisenhower families are tied together. Right, so Nixon is going to be vice president for 8 years under Dwight Eisenhower. Then when Eisenhower is no longer allowed to run for a third term, the Republicans in 1960 run Nixon instead. And his opponent is John F. Kennedy. Right? And this is a very close presidential election that features the first presidential debate. And Nixon narrowly loses both the popular vote and the Electoral College. But it is an incredibly close election. So, in 1962, Richard Nixon runs to be governor of California. And he runs and he's fails to win. Right? And so he gives a speech saying that he's quitting politics. And what would the press do if there's no longer Richard Nixon to abuse? So it seems like even though he'd been vice president, he had failed in his run for president, failed in his run for governor. But then in 1964, the Republicans get blown out running Barry Goldwater against Lyndon Johnson. So then in 1968, Richard Nixon somehow manages to get the Republican nomination once again. And he's getting a second chance at this. And it looks like the Democratic nominee is going to be Robert Kennedy. And so that would have been a situation where it would have been like close to a rematch in 1968 as you could have possibly thought. But then RFK got assassinated. So he ends up going against Hubert Humphrey, the vice president, and Richard Nixon wins the 1968 presidential election. He wins the Electoral College pretty handily, but he barely wins the popular vote. It's a very contentious and close election, so then Nixon is president. Nixon's a Republican president, but he has a Democratic Congress. There is a time retirement office. The House and the Senate are controlled by Democrats. So this means there are some interesting things. For example, the Environmental Protection Agency was started under Richard Nixon. The Endangered Species Act was passed under Richard Nixon. Nixon, even at one point, was talking about a universal health care bill under Richard Nixon, but that's partly because he has to work with the Democratic Congress. So, in 1972, he runs against George McGovern, very liberal senator from South Dakota, and Nixon just destroys him. He wins 49 states, every state but Massachusetts. Right, so Nixon won big, and there was not much chance that McGovern was ever going to beat him. But Nixon does something during this campaign that he shouldn't have done. What does he do? His committee to re-elect the president, or CREEP, bugs the Democratic National Headquarters at the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C. And one of their bugs stopped working, so they send a second team in, and they get caught at Watergate. This happens right before the election. Things were going pretty well for Nixon, right? He had gone to China and helped open up relations with China. It had been JFK's commitment to get a man on the moon by the end of the 60s, but it was under Nixon that we actually got a man on the moon. He had this landslide re-election, but he had to go and mess it up. Now, he has a vice president, Spiro Agnew, been the Republican governor of Maryland. He gets himself in a completely unrelated scandal that involves him taking bribes when he was governor of Maryland, as well as not paying his taxes. And so Spiro Agnew resigns. Right, so Nixon has to pick a new vice president that can get through a Democratic Congress. So he picks Gerald Ford. Right, so Nixon has there Ford. Well, then the Watergate scandal keeps on unfoiling, and the Watergate scandal deserves its own video. The crux of it is that Nixon taped a lot of his conversations. There's some that Lyndon Johnson told him to do, and there was a lot of evidence that Nixon had orchestrated what happened with Watergate. So the House of Representatives is preparing to impeach him. It looks like he's going to get impeached, and the Senate is probably going to convict him and remove him from office. Because people have an issue with Nixon doing this, they don't have an issue with Gerald Ford. And so Nixon resigns on August 9th, 1974, rather than face impeachment and conviction. So we'll never know what actually would happen there. Then his successor, Gerald Ford, is going to pardon him a month later. So he never faces a political trial or a criminal trial, and he'll live another 20 years. So Richard Nixon was an incredibly complicated individual who had some great successes in his life, but he also was a fundamentally paranoid person. Right? And he had many enemies, real and perceived, that he was always concerned about. But in the end, his greatest enemy was himself. He got in the way of his own success, resulting in him being the only president that has ever resigned. Next time, we'll talk about Gerald Ford.